The prince cried when he discovered why she never looked him in the eyes. Spring arrived in Sveltorna like a breath held too long, sudden, almost too soft to trust. The air carried a chill beneath the perfume of budding magnolias, and in the heart of the capital, the royal palace shone with a brightness that did not belong to the sky, but to hundreds of beeswax candles, mirrored sconces, and chandeliers dripping with Venetian crystal. The ballroom, with its polished marble floor and tall arched windows thrown open to the night, pulsed with the rhythm of stringed instruments and the hum of anticipation. Every noble family of consequence had arrived. The men stood in high-heeled shoes and embroidered justaucorps, powdered wigs perched like theatrical declarations. The women moved like porcelain swans beneath canopies of silk, their gowns stiff with embroidery and trimmed in Flemish lace. He was coming home. Prince Henrik Ulrich of Liesendal had been abroad for more than a year, navigating treaties and coastal disputes with the Hanseatic powers. He had left a promising diplomat. He returned a symbol of youth, continuity, and power wrapped in princely charm. Though unmarried, he had not lacked for attention, and every matron present had come with a daughter groomed for the task of captivating him. Near the rear of the ballroom, partially obscured by a pillar gilded in gold leaf, stood a young woman who did not belong, not entirely. Elira Winter held a glass of watered wine in one gloved hand, her chin lifted, her posture faultless. She wore a pine green gown, too modest to be fashionable, too refined to be servant's garb. Her presence was tolerated, though not welcomed. As companion to the Dowager Duchess Annalore, Elira's role was to remain present but invisible, a living shadow. She had been raised in the language of propriety, yet the court had not forgotten who her father had been, nor how he had fallen. 15 years ago, Lord Darren Winter had stood at the prince's father's right hand, a reformist, a strategist, a patriot, and then a traitor. That was the word whispered in corridors after he was exiled, stripped of title and property, erased from the court's memory as if he had never belonged. His only child had been 9 years old. Elira had not seen him since. As the musicians paused, the great doors to the ballroom opened. Applause rippled through the hall like thunder caught in a cage. Henrik Ulrich entered with the elegance of a man who had been trained for precisely this moment since birth. His justaucorps was deep navy, silver-threaded at the cuffs and lapels with delicate knotwork patterns. A royal sash crossed his chest, and the hilt of his ceremonial sword glittered at his hip. His light blonde hair was tied back at the nape of his neck, his jaw smooth, and his posture effortless. The very image of composed nobility. Everyone turned to him. Everyone, save one. Elira remained still. Her eyes did not seek the prince. Instead, they lingered on the far wall, where a tapestry depicting a forgotten battle hung motionless. Her grip on her glass did not falter. She did not curtsy. She did not move. Henrik's gaze swept the room. He acknowledged the bows and curtsies with a soft smile, polite and distant. But as his eyes passed over Elira, they paused. There was something jarring in her stillness. Not defiance exactly, but a kind of resolute quiet that resisted interpretation. She was not beautiful in the exaggerated style of court. No powdered curls, no jewel-encrusted bodice. And yet, he found he could not look away. She did not glance at him. Not once. The Duchess, seated near the ballroom's raised dais, lifted her fan with subtle unease. Henrik made his way to the head of the room, accepting greetings with cordial disinterest. The orchestra resumed. Dancers returned to the floor. The moment passed. Almost. Across the room, Lady Breitha of Meersholm, barely 17 and dressed like a confection of ivory, silk and pearls, leaned toward her companions. Loud enough to be heard by several, she said sweetly. It's brave, isn't it? To appear at court when one's father sold secrets to the king's enemies. A few ladies tittered nervously. One man turned away as if he hadn't heard. Elira's spine straightened, though it had not been bowed. She said nothing. Lady Breatha smiled wider, feigning innocence. I meant no offense, of course. It's admirable, in a way. The courage to show one's face. Silence swept the space like a sudden chill. Elira took one slow breath, then another. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and low. I believe courage is often misnamed, she said. So is cruelty. Lady Breatha paled. Before a reply could form, the Duchess closed her fan with a soft snap. The movement, though minor, was a signal. Elira inclined her head to the Duchess and, with careful poise, turned and left the ballroom. No one stopped her. No one followed. The corridor outside was cool and still. A solitary candelabrum flickered in the draught, casting long shadows across the white and blue tiled floor. Elira walked without hurry, though her heart thudded like a drum beneath her stays. Only when she reached the privacy of the Duchess's sitting room did she exhale fully. She removed her gloves, one finger at a time, her hands only faintly trembling. Her expression remained unreadable, her mouth relaxed, eyes steady. But there was a pressure behind her ribs. The familiar weight of being reminded that no matter how well she dressed, how well she spoke or moved, the stain of her family name could not be scrubbed away. The Duchess entered moments later. She closed the door and moved to the window, pausing to adjust the curtain. Her face, round and pale, held neither anger nor pity. I've spoken with the steward, she said. We leave tomorrow morning for the Marinthal estate. The court has grown restless. I'd prefer quiet. Elira nodded. Of course, Your Grace. I believe the sea air will do us good, and you'll find fewer sharp tongues in Marinthal. Yes. The Duchess gave her a long look, unreadable behind her lace-edged fan. Then, with a small nod, she turned and left. Elira stood still for a moment, listening to the click of the door, the faint muffled music still floating from the ballroom far below. Then she walked to her chamber, lit a single lamp, and began folding her gowns into the travel trunk. The movements were methodical, each dress arranged with care, though she knew none would be worn for anything beyond the Duchess's company. She worked in silence, the soft rustle of fabric the only sound. At one point she paused at the window. The palace rose like a crown against the night sky, its towers aglow with candlelight. Laughter echoed faintly across the gardens. From a balcony above, someone stood alone, watching the moonlit grounds with a posture of quiet thought. She did not know it was the prince, and he did not know that the woman he could not stop thinking about was already preparing to disappear from his world. At dawn, before the first bell rang across the palace courtyard, a rider in royal livery arrived at the Duchess's estate with a second sealed letter in hand, and this time it bore Prince Henrik's crest. The estate at Marinthal stood like a breath held above the sea. Wide, pale stone walls etched with salt and time, perched on cliffs that crumbled gently into the grey-blue tide below. It had been built generations ago as a summer retreat, a place meant for quiet reading and slow walks, far from the pageantry of court. Wild lavender grew along the gravel paths. Wind bent the hedges into soft curves, and the ocean, always near, whispered against the shore with a voice older than the land itself. Elira Vinter found the air here easier to breathe. She had arrived with the Duchess Annalore just after sunrise. The journey had taken 2 days by carriage, a rough ride softened only by the view. Long fields stretching toward the coast, spring trees just beginning to bloom. The moment she stepped from the coach and felt the salt on her skin, she'd known she was further from judgment than she'd been in years. The Duchess settled into her summer routine almost immediately. Afternoon naps, embroidery, and short walks in the sun when the wind allowed. Elira's duties became lighter in the absence of formal events. She poured tea, read aloud when asked, and kept correspondence in order. Most days, the Duchess required no company at all. It left Elira with long stretches of time, and she used them with quiet purpose. She wandered the orchard that curved around the rear of the house, read old books from the estate's modest library, and answered a small trickle of letters from acquaintances too polite to forget her entirely. She never forgot, even in those peaceful moments, that stillness was never permanent. It was mid-morning when she first saw the royal crest again. The orchard was small, the trees pruned low for wind and season, their white blossoms trembling in the early breeze. Elira carried a basket lined with linen, the faint scent of ripening pears clinging to her sleeves. She had just reached the main path back to the house when the low rumble of wheels and hooves reached her ears. She turned, squinting into the sun. A carriage approached from the east road, the livery unmistakable, deep blue with silver trim, the royal sigil painted large on each door. The driver wore the colors of the prince's personal household. Her breath caught. Within minutes, the coach passed through the iron gates and rolled into the circular drive. Elira remained hidden beneath a flowering apple tree, her pulse quickening despite her stillness. When the door opened and Prince Henrik stepped out, the scent of the orchard was swallowed by something sharper. The crackle of old fears returning. He moved like someone unused to being watched. His coat was travel-stained but elegant, and his boots bore dust from the road. He greeted the steward with a few quiet words and offered the Duchess a formal bow as she stepped onto the portico. His manner was correct, his voice pleasant. But his gaze drifted. It found her. Elira stepped back before she could be seen, her skirts brushing the damp grass. Later, she learned that the prince's arrival had been explained as an inspection of local shipping interests, a matter of state. Marinthal had grown in economic importance, and the crown was increasingly invested in its trade. Still, the timing felt too swift, too deliberate. She said nothing, and neither did the Duchess, though her silence carried weight. The next days passed slowly. Henrik did not leave. He took long walks along the cliffs with the local baron, discussed harbour construction with the steward, reviewed maps in the drawing room. Yet always, Elira felt his presence circling hers. At breakfast, he sat 2 chairs down. In the garden, his footsteps crunched the path just behind hers. Once in the courtyard, she turned and found him watching her. Not boldly, but with a quiet interest that unsettled more than flattery ever could. She kept her voice low and her gaze lowered. But on the 5th day, he found her alone. The estate's library was a modest space, filled with sun-faded volumes and the scent of ink and wood polish. She had come seeking a volume of poetry, something to read to the Duchess before supper. Standing on the small step-stool, her fingers skimmed the spines along the upper shelf. "I wondered," came a voice behind her, quiet and level, "whether it was intentional." She turned without hurry. He stood at the threshold, leaning lightly against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. His coat was unbuttoned, revealing a plain ivory waistcoat, the color catching in the light from the tall window. "I beg your pardon, Your Highness," she said evenly. He stepped forward, not too close, but enough that she could see the pale flecks in his eyes. "Your refusal to look at me. I wondered if it was by design." Elira descended the step-stool with unhurried grace and replaced the book she'd chosen. "I do not refuse anything," she said. "Nor have I disrespected you." "No," he agreed. "You haven't. That's part of the mystery." Her fingers curled around the back of a chair. "There's no mystery. Merely a preference for discretion." He watched her for a long moment, then nodded. "I see." She offered nothing more. The silence stretched. Henrik gave a short, almost inaudible breath, not quite a sigh. "It's rare," he said finally, "to meet someone who doesn't try to please me. I'm not sure whether I find it admirable or infuriating." Elira kept her voice calm. "That seems a problem best solved by leaving them alone." He stared at her a moment longer, then turned and walked to the door. Just before leaving, he glanced back. Just once, before disappearing into the hall. She stood motionless for several seconds after he had gone. Then she reached for the volume of poetry again, holding it tighter than necessary. That night, the wind came in from the sea with teeth. Elira lit a candle in her chamber, and unlatched her trunk. Beneath her folded gowns and a lavender sachet was a small wooden box, no larger than a jewelry case. She pulled it free and sat on the edge of her bed before lifting the lid. Inside, wrapped in linen yellowed with age, was a letter. The paper had curled at the edges. The ink faded. The handwriting was familiar, slanted, and precise. It was dated the day her father had been exiled. She had read it before, too many times to count, but each reading brought a quiet weight that settled on her chest. My dearest Elira, there will be lies spoken in the name of order. I have been betrayed, not by enemies, but by those I once called brother. You must guard yourself. The Duke wears the crown's colors, but his loyalty is to power, not justice. Do not trust any who serve his voice. She closed her eyes briefly. The words had not changed. The truth they carried had not faded. And at the heart of the betrayal, always, was Duke Grevar of Marienholt, chief advisor to the crown, uncle to Prince Henrik. Elira folded the letter with care and placed it back in the box. The candle flickered as the wind lashed against the shutters. Somewhere in the corridor beyond, she heard footsteps pass, slow and measured. A knock sounded at the door. When she opened it, a maid stood there with a folded note and eyes full of apprehension. "The steward asked me to bring this, miss," the girl whispered. "It's from the capital. The Duke knows you're here." The spring in Marinthal matured slowly, softening each day like butter left to warm in a sunlit kitchen. The lemon trees near the edge of the orchard began to bloom, their pale flowers casting a clean, citrus sweetness into the air. The sea, once gray and restless, stretched calm and silver under the wide sky. The rhythm of the estate shifted with the change of season, becoming something looser, slower, less governed by the relentless pace of court, and more by the wind, the weather, and the tide. And yet, something in the household had quickened. Prince Henrik had not left. What was meant to be a brief inspection of local shipping operations had extended into weeks. He sent dispatches regularly, formal, sealed, and bearing the royal crest, stating his presence was required for further oversight of naval construction and continued talks with the harbor's trading guild. But everyone, from the Duchess to the kitchen maids, understood the weight behind appearances. The prince had found a reason to stay, and that reason was no longer business. His presence became a constant hum in the background of Elira's days. At breakfast, he lingered over coffee, asking polite questions about Marinthal's coastal laws. In the afternoons, he walked with the Duchess through the lemon grove and always found a way to fall in step beside Elira. She began to see his shadow long before she heard his voice. He spoke of art, of music, of the latest French translations of Roman poetry. He asked her thoughts on property rights and trade routes, listening as though her opinion might shift something in him. It was not courtship, not exactly. But it wasn't not. He did not flirt. He didn't flatter. What he did was worse. He noticed the tone of her voice when she was tired, the way she turned her face slightly into the wind when thinking. He asked questions and waited for her to answer them in full. He looked at her as though her silences were puzzles he was determined to solve. Elira told herself it was nothing. She maintained the posture of discretion. She did not touch his arm, did not speak his name unless formally required. And yet, each morning when she dressed, she found herself smoothing her bodice more carefully, tying her fichu more precisely. She began carrying a book to the orchard not just to read, but in case he passed through. She resisted, but only barely. One morning, they walked slowly beneath the lemon trees, the sun making silver ladders on the path between the branches. He asked if she preferred Horace or Virgil. She told him she thought Horace was the better poet, but the weaker man. He stopped walking and looked at her for a long moment, then said, "That's a very rare thing, for someone to be able to say both." She laughed then, just once, softly. It slipped out of her before she could stop it. He didn't smile at the sound. He watched her with something quieter, something like wonder. In that moment, The air seemed suspended between them, neither warm nor cold. A pause that lingered too long. She turned away first, her hands folded neatly in front of her, but something shifted after. In the servants' hall, conversations paused. The Duchess's maid, a sensible woman, began to look at her. Elira said nothing, but she felt the change like pressure building under the skin. It came to a point 3 days later, in the drawing room of Baron Halverson's manor. The gathering was formal, though smaller than a court assembly. A few local families, a handful of visiting merchants, and the principal nobility of the province. The Duchess wore a gown of dove-gray silk with pearls at her throat. Elira's own gown was darker, her only ornament a plain silver ribbon in her hair. The Baron's wife had arranged a quartet to play near the hearth, and the music filled the corners of the room with soft, lulling rhythm. Elira stood near a window, her hands lightly clasped. She had not spoken to Henrik since the morning. When he entered, fashionably late, conversation ebbed for a moment. He made his greetings with practiced ease, but his eyes searched until they found her. He moved toward her. No hesitation. She saw it coming and still could not prepare for the weight of it when he stopped before her, bowed his head slightly and extended his hand. "May I have the honor?" he asked, voice even. There was no mistaking what he meant. All conversation died. A prince did not ask a disgraced woman to dance, not at court, and not here. She looked at him for one long, tremulous second. Her breath caught in her chest, and then she placed her hand in his. The dance was a simple waltz. The space around them opened wide as though the very air had drawn back. The quartet played on, steady and unaware of the knife-edge tension that had overtaken the room. His hand was warm, his grip careful. She kept her eyes lowered. Her heart pounded in her throat. "I shouldn't have," he murmured. "You didn't," she answered. But they danced. One slow turn, then another. When the music ended, he bowed and released her hand with care, like setting down something delicate. She curtsied. The room did not move until he turned away. Later that night, Elira paced her chamber. The shutters rattled gently in the sea breeze, and the candle flame cast long shapes across the wall. Her hands opened and closed at her sides. The gown she had worn to the gathering lay across the bed, one sleeve slipping toward the floor. She could not keep the words in anymore. It had gone too far. She opened the wooden box once more. The letter lay folded inside, the paper thinner than she remembered. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted it, rereading the lines that had never left her mind. Betrayal. Lies. The Duke. The crown. She would tell him. Tonight. Before anything else grew between them. Before more was lost. She crossed the corridor barefoot, the letter folded in her palm. The hall was silent, but not empty. Far below, she could hear the clink of glass and soft voices from the kitchen. The scent of lemon blossoms clung faintly to the linen of her nightrobe. She had nearly reached the prince's guest chamber when the sound shattered the stillness. A carriage, the sharp ring of hooves on stone, and then raised voices. She froze. A door slammed. The entry hall filled with movement. She didn't need to descend the stairs. The voice reached her, unmistakable even across marble and air, low, commanding, cold. The Duke had arrived. The air in the estate seemed to constrict, as if the wind had turned inward. A hush fell over the servants. The candles flickered. She backed away, heart pounding, the letter still in her hand. Down the corridor, a maid rounded the corner breathless, skirts swinging. Her eyes went wide at the sight of Elira. "You must go back to your room," the girl whispered. "Now. The Duke has summoned the prince, and he says you are not to be seen." Duke Grevar of Marienholt did not knock when he entered a room. He did not pause before interrupting a conversation or soften his step for the sake of civility. By noon on the day after his arrival, the estate no longer belonged to the Duchess, or the prince, or the distant hum of the sea. It belonged to him. The temperature in the manor had not changed, but the air had. It was heavier now, tense with awareness. The servants moved more quietly. The hallways, once soft with the scent of lemon and parchment, now carried only the sharp undercurrent of tension. Grevard brought no chaos, only order so precise it cut. Within 2 hours of stepping onto the stone threshold, he had summoned the Duchess to the drawing room. Elira did not witness the exchange, but she saw the Duchess after, her mouth drawn tight, her spine straight as a blade. She said nothing of what passed between them, only called for tea and sat beneath the west window with a stiffness that did not ease for the rest of the afternoon. Henrik was next. Grevard called for him in the south parlour, a room once meant for music, now swallowed in silence. When Henrik emerged nearly an hour later, his expression was unreadable. His movements, however, lacked the calm he usually wore like armor. He walked too quickly. His jaw was tense. His gaze flicked toward every corner, as if anticipating opposition. By the time dusk settled over the coast, the tone of the estate had shifted entirely. The sun dipped behind the cliffs, and with it went any sense of ease. Elira kept to the smaller corridors where few would follow her. She did not seek Henrik, though her thoughts wrapped themselves tightly around his absence, each passing hour leaving a deeper impression. Her hands had not stopped shaking since the night before. She was making her way toward the library when she turned a corner and stopped short. The Duke stood at the end of the corridor, his back to the long windows where the last of the day's light pooled like water on the floor. He did not speak immediately, only turned slowly, as if he had known she would appear. "Miss Vinter," he said, his voice even, "I was wondering if you might allow me a word." She did not answer. He moved toward her, unhurried. His coat was impeccable, not a thread out of place. The polished heels of his shoes tapped softly against the stone. "I remember your father," he said, "a gifted man, ambitious. He spoke often of principle." Still, she said nothing. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his mouth. His eyes were pale gray, emotionless even in proximity. "Association with the royal family," he said, voice low, "is a delicate thing. Sometimes it is a blessing. Other times—" He let the words trail off, then smiled faintly. "It has a way of unearthing the past. Not all soil is meant to be disturbed." Elira's spine remained straight. She turned her head slightly to face him, though her voice remained quiet. "Is that a threat, Your Grace?" "It's an observation," he replied. "Your father's name was once spoken in every hall of power. And now it lingers, rotting beneath accusations some consider best forgotten. Until, of course, someone insists on remembrance." She drew a breath through her nose, slow and deliberate. "If you continue this course," Grevard murmured, "your father's shame will not only be revisited, it will become yours." He stepped back, only slightly. "What you are doing is unwise, and worse, it is dangerous." She said nothing, but around the corner, in the darkened antechamber that had once stored ledgers and maps, Henrik stood still as stone. He had not meant to follow his uncle. But when he heard the voice, low and too even, curiosity turned to suspicion. He had taken shelter behind the arched opening of the servants' hallway, and then could not move. He had seen Elira's face. He had heard every word. What he felt then was not surprise, but fury, quiet, searing, and complete. It settled not in his chest, but lower, anchoring itself where words lived and love began. That night, the household gathered for dinner as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The long table, glittering with polished silver and tall candelabra, was arranged precisely, every plate and glass in its place. Grevard sat near the head, as protocol demanded. The Duchess sat beside him. Elira had been placed further down, between two quiet minor lords with nothing to say. Henrik stood at the far end, a place of respect, but also of separation. Dinner proceeded in murmurs, the conversation light. The food, artfully prepared, passed from hand to hand with little attention paid. Until, just as the second course was removed, Henrik stood. Every movement at the table stilled. His voice, when it came, was clear but quiet, measured. "There is something I've long wondered," he said. "How a man of principle could fall from grace so quickly. How a single accusation, unproven, could ruin not only a reputation but a family." Every utensil was set down. Grevar's head turned slightly, though he did not look directly at him. Henrik continued, "We speak often in court of honor. But I wonder what we mean by it. Is it honor to protect power by any means necessary? Or is it justice we should aim for?" No one breathed. "I believe," Henrik said, "that buried truths have a way of surfacing, whether we make room for them or not." Still, he did not name her, but his meaning was carved into every word. Grevar leaned back, his expression unreadable. "It's a dangerous thing to disturb the past, Your Highness. One must be certain there is something to find." "Perhaps it is time we do," Henrik said. The Duchess said nothing. But the next morning, when the household gathered for breakfast, the seating had changed. Elira found her place beside the prince. She sat in silence. But when she reached for her teacup, her hand did not tremble. They did not speak in public. But later, as the sun moved higher and the house emptied to its quiet rhythm, Elira found him in the orchard. He turned to her before she spoke. "I have something to show you," she said. He followed without hesitation. They sat in a corner of the drawing room, shielded by tall bookshelves and quiet. She held the wooden box in her lap, her fingers curled around the edges. When she opened it and handed him the letter, her voice was steady. "My father wrote this the day he was exiled." He read in silence. The room was still but for the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. When he looked up, there was no distance left in his face, only something stripped bare. She told him everything then. Her mother's decline after the disgrace, the loneliness, the rumors, the eyes that turned cold even in childhood. She spoke of her promise never to forgive, of the anger that had become part of her. When she finished, the silence lingered between them, thick and unyielding. Finally, she asked the question that had lived unspoken for too long. "If it comes to your family or to me," she said, "whom will you choose?" He stared at her, but no answer came. And then he stood and walked away. Henrik returned to the capital alone. He rode without escort, the letter folded in his breast pocket, pressed close to his chest, like a wound he refused to bind. The roads from Marenthal were quiet, lined with trees in full bloom, but he noticed none of them. The wind off the plains carried the last of spring's coolness, brushing past his coat, stirring the edges of his gloves. Still, he felt too warm. The palace gates opened before him at dusk. The familiar spires and domes rose in the fading light, untouched, unmoved by the weight he carried. Inside, the servants bowed, and courtiers whispered his name, but he gave no audience, requested no welcome. He went directly to his chambers, removed the traveling dust from his coat, and sat at the old mahogany desk where his father once kept royal correspondence. The next morning, before the court had fully stirred, he began. His first visit was to Lord Brackham, a retired minister who had once served with Lord Vinter. The man's hands trembled with age, but his eyes sharpened the moment he saw the handwriting on the letter. "I remember the day," he said quietly. "It was fast, too fast. Vinter was removed before half of us knew the charges, and the council, half were excused from the vote without cause." Henrik asked questions, and the answers came slowly, as if time itself had loosened its grip on silence. There were letters that never reached their destinations, papers that vanished from archives, signatures forged in a hand just close enough to pass as legitimate. The names that reappeared again and again were the same: Duke Grevar and those who owed him favor. The prince moved carefully. His inquiries were not public. He did not summon his uncle. He did not speak at court. But he watched. He waited. In a locked cabinet in the royal library, He found a copy of a memorandum once authored by Lord Winter, an economic proposal that threatened Grevar's hold over the northern trade routes. In the margins, another hand had scrawled comments. Too ambitious. Needs quieting. And in one place, unmistakably, remove from position before spring vote. Henrik took the document and filed it in his personal record. He visited former scribes, servants, even an elderly courier who remembered delivering an unsigned warrant to Lord Winter's estate the morning before his exile. Piece by piece, the truth emerged, not clean, but clear. The exile had not been justice. It had been preservation, a calculated move to consolidate influence and eliminate a man who had stood in the way. When the evidence had gathered past the point of silence, Henrik called a private session of the Crown Council. The chamber was quiet, lit only by tall windows and the dull gleam of candle sconces. The councillors arrived slowly, unsure of what they'd been summoned to hear. Duke Grevar entered last, his steps composed, his face a mask of civility. Henrik stood, not as a prince demanding loyalty, but as a man refusing to be blind. He laid the letter before them, the testimony, the forged document, the erased votes. He did not raise his voice. He did not appeal to emotion, only to conscience. When he finished, the room was silent. Grevar leaned back in his chair. "This is conjecture," he said, smooth and dismissive. "Old men's memories, faded ink. You would stain your own name with the word of a disgraced traitor." Henrik's voice was steady. "I would honor the truth, even if it shames my name." The council did not decide then, but the tide had turned. The inquiry was opened formally, and the documents were sealed into record. Within a fortnight, the court issued its finding. Lord Darren Winter had been exiled under false pretense, based on manipulated reports and unsupported claims. His estate, though long dissolved, was to be acknowledged posthumously, and his name cleared in full. The news reached Marinthal on a soft, clear morning. The Duchess stood on the east terrace when Elira was called to her. The letter she handed over bore the royal seal, but the envelope was addressed in Henrik's hand. Elira read it once, then twice. Her breath caught on the second line. She did not speak. The Duchess, with her usual precision, said, "You are not a servant, Miss Winter. Not anymore. You never truly were." 2 days later, Elira stepped down from a private carriage at the palace gates. This time no one whispered. Inside, the corridors were hushed, the tapestries familiar. The scent of old stone and beeswax filled the air. She walked in silence, her steps steady, her heart too full to tremble. Henrik was waiting in the garden. He wore no ceremonial sash, no crown, no gloves. Only a dark coat, and an expression that belonged not to a prince, but to a man who had come to a truth too slowly, and would spend the rest of his life making it right. She stopped before him. He did not bow. He stepped forward and took her hand. "I was a coward," he said quietly, "but I'm not anymore." She said nothing. She didn't need to. That afternoon, among white roses and budding lilacs, before a gathering of only the Crown Council and the Duchess, Henrik made his intentions known. Elira Winter was to be his wife. No one objected. Some offered congratulations aloud, others in silence. But none questioned the rightness of the moment. Not now. The engagement was sealed with no fanfare, no grand declaration. Only a quiet promise made beneath the arched branches of the garden that had once been a place of shame. The next morning, the same garden was filled with birdsong. Elira stood at the edge of the fountain, her hands clasped before her. The sunlight caught in the folds of her pale gown, making her glow. Henrik stepped beside her, not with pomp, but peace. She turned to face him. This time she met his gaze without hesitation. His eyes filled, slowly, without shame, not with sorrow, but with something older and deeper. Reverence. She reached for his hand. And this time, when their fingers twined, there was no fear left to hold them apart. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the story? Leave us a comment, telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like to show your support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotions and life lessons. And before we say goodbye, we'd like to remind you that on the end screen, you'll see a recommendation for another exciting and charming story. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.